To engage in Western meditation, or what I call structured thoughts, we have to be able to apply whatever we are meditating upon to wherever we are, physically, spiritually, psychologically, etc. Without doing so, our approach to the universe is trite and completely inflexible. The inner torch becomes useless and fades away, and the torches handed to us by priests or lesser masters seem equally dead and played out. Therefore, one topic is indispensable to this channel.
Talking about Mary is the place where God becomes present. She's the temple. She's also all of the other places in which God manifests his presence. She's the burning bush. She's the cloud that leads the Israelites as they're moving through the desert. She could be the Holy of Holies. I mean, a lot of it is a very long list, right? If you're going to describe what it means to think about the incarnation, to say God entered into his creation through Mary, in effect, you end up having to describe the whole of creation, because you're trying to describe the way in which she contained in her womb the one whom the heavens themselves could not contain.
Before we properly get into the topic, I'd like to draw your attention to a simple image that has been making the rounds on the internet for quite a while now. It shows how two, seemingly contradictory, truths can be revoked in one full truth. Whilst there are some problems in how these ideas are approached nowadays, they nevertheless speak to a very important fact of life, that we experience higher truths rarely by themselves, but rather through imprints they make onto our reality, imprints that might be incomplete but are nevertheless true. This is also wisdom that can be found in later mystical writings, who point out that we do not experience full reality but rather our senses' perception of reality, warning us of assuming that we hold any modicum of full truth. In terms of my channel, this means that none of my statements can be seen as exclusive unless stated otherwise. If I, for example, say that Jesus is the Christian version of the world tree, then this doesn't mean that the world tree is a full or apt description of Christ, but rather that the pure idea of the world tree is a facet of the full divinity of Christ. This gets especially tricky when keeping in mind the extratemporal status of divine principles, which means that many earthly distinctions don't apply. In the Bible, for example, heavenly constructs are sometimes described as places, like the kingdom for Jesus and the pit for the fallen ones, and these are not metaphors, but part of the heavenly form. And once we have understood this divine identity, we can start to see how it applies to us. When we take the kingdom into our heart, we grow within us not just a kingdom, but also a character that is in line with the kingdom, a Christ on our own level, who derives from the totality of the Logos, a process called theosis in the Eastern Church. An important part to note here is that between the facet and the full, there is a level of distinction. So theosis is different from the modern or New Age concept called Christ consciousness, where the person makes a claim of being, quote, just like Christ, unquote, which is a type of apotheosis. On the contrary, if we separate from God, then we grow in ourselves an endless pit, a place that can never be filled, a hole in our chest that so many in the modern world are so familiar with. With this idea of the true facets of truth, understanding typology is rather simple, as the word type derives its meaning from the Greek typos, which means as much as a dent, impression, mark, effect, outline, or sketch. So when an artist creates a portrait of a king, the painting becomes a type of the king and serves as a hint to his full being. The higher form the type describes is then called the antitype. So in the previous example, the painting is the king's type and the king is the painting's antitype. Extrapolating on that, when we say that art, quote, has a soul, unquote, then what we usually mean is that it has a corresponding antitype, whilst something soulless gives no hint to a higher concept. Type and antitype are typically separated by their nature, or level of being, with the type usually having a lower level of being than the antitype. Going back to the initial example of truth, the true object was part of the three-dimensional world, whilst the two derivative truths were part of the two-dimensional world. And here again you can see the sketch character of the type that puts something vast into something smaller. This nature is also the reason why we call types made of personalities a caricature. An important fact for personal life is that the treatment of the type will influence the treatment of the antitype, and the treatment of the antitype will influence the treatment of the type. This can be seen, for example, in the American counterculture, which treated its temporal fathers the same as it did the Father in heaven. In the video on Heaven and Earth, I have outlined many outcomes of a materialist mindset, of putting Earth over heaven, and all these changes did take place in the West by the same mechanism. This relation, type to antitype, antitype to type, the greatest and the smallest, and the microscopic in the vast, weaves itself throughout creation, giving meaning to each atom and character to the galaxy. Once recognized, it allows us to see the cosmos not as accident, but as a grand stage, playing out the same eternal play a billion times over. The play is written in heaven, thus we look for stars to spell it out to us, and depending on what those stars may be for us, we will understand it differently. And just how a seafarer will use the physical stars for navigation, so each of us uses their divine stars to walk through life. A good way to check if one has understood a type's corresponding antitype is to try to form other types from it. If these make sense on their own and align with reality, the antitype is usually somewhat understood. Otherwise, it is either untrue or misunderstood. This is especially true for poetry, where it is often worthwhile to look for symbols or metaphors antitype and to derive new types from it. It is important to note that people have a natural impulse to typologize. However, this does not mean that it just works naturally. The danger here is called being arbitrary. Arbitrary derives from the word arbiter, meaning judge, and means as much as using one's own judgment, implying that one doesn't have the faculty to judge correctly. So in approaching typology, we always have to be wary to understand the antitype. And if we don't understand it, we need someone else to typologize it for us. A related mistake is that of stereotyping. This mistake, whilst often lauded by modern society, is not understood by it, and ironically, a chronic element of it. Stereotyping comes from the word stereo, meaning hard or solid, and of course the word type. It means treating the antitype as if it were the type. So for example, treating people like a caricature of themselves. The modern world approaches most of reality by the use of models, who are types by definition. It usually forgets this, however, and treats the model as a full representation of reality by using it as the foundation for its decision-making. I am constantly wary of relating a worldview that puts all of divinity into a purely metaphysical concept, whereby it is only a world of ideas that cannot be translated into reality unless by human action. So I want to point out that in divinity, these heavenly concepts manifest, as can be seen, for example, in the ongoing catalogue of verifiable miracles taking place in the Church, but also in the life and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which is not only a complete antitype which can be applied to each individual life, but also historical. Here we see the concept and the reality perfectly coincide, and whilst that isn't always the case by far, it does happen frequently on many other levels as well.